Serial killers. The phrase alone stirs unease and fascination in equal measure. These individuals, often hidden in plain sight, commit acts of violence so heinous that they remain etched in our collective memory. Across history, serial killers have captured the darkest corners of human imagination. But why does society remain intrigued by their stories? Perhaps it's the sheer contrast between their ordinary appearances and their extraordinary capacity for evil. Perhaps it's the questions they leave unanswered. What drives someone to such cruelty? And most hauntingly, could they be walking among us? Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous names in American criminal history. Born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's early life was steeped in deception. He was raised by his grandparents under the belief that they were his parents and that his biological mother was his sister. This lie, revealed to him as a teenager, deeply unsettled him and may have contributed to the psychological turmoil that defined his later years. Bundy was intelligent, well-educated, and charming. He studied psychology at the University of Washington and even worked for a time at a suicide prevention hotline. This facade of normalcy allowed him to gain the trust of those around him. However, beneath the surface, Bundy harbored dark fantasies of violence and control. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy embarked on a killing spree that spanned multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His modus operandi was as chilling as it was effective. He would feign injury by wearing a sling or cast and ask women for help. Once they were close, he would overpower them, abducting and murdering them. Bundy confessed to killing 30 women, but authorities believe the true number could be much higher. One of his earliest known victims, Linda Ann Healy, disappeared from her Seattle home in 1974. Healy was a bright, talented college student whose disappearance shocked the community. He often revisited his crime scenes, engaging in necrophilia with the corpses of his victims. Bundy was arrested in 1975, but his story didn't end there. He escaped from custody twice, including a dramatic escape from a Colorado courthouse where he jumped from a second-story window. After his second escape, he fled to Florida, where he committed his most infamous crime, the brutal attack on the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, killing 2 women and severely injuring 2 others. Bundy was finally apprehended in 1978 and sentenced to death. His trial was a media sensation, with Bundy representing himself and using his charm to manipulate the courtroom. He was executed in the electric chair in 1989. Ted Bundy's story is a chilling reminder of how easily trust can be exploited and how appearances can be deceiving. Jeffrey Dahmer was dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer's actions shocked the nation with their sheer brutality. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer had a difficult childhood. His parents' tumultuous marriage and eventual divorce, combined with his growing sense of isolation, shaped much of his early life. Even as a teenager, Dahmer showed troubling behavior, including a fascination with dead animals, often dissecting roadkill and preserving their remains. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978 at the age of 18, shortly after graduating from high school. His victim, Stephen Hicks, was a hitchhiker. Dahmer lured to his home under the pretense of sharing drinks. When Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, killing him. He then dismembered Hicks's body and disposed of the remains in the woods. This marked the beginning of a chilling pattern that would escalate over the next 13 years. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer killed 17 young men, most of whom he lured to his apartment with promises of companionship, money, or photographs. His victims were predominantly gay men, many of them marginalized individuals from the LGBTQ+ and racial minority communities. Once in his apartment, Dahmer would drug his victims, kill them, and then engage in necrophilia and cannibalism. He kept body parts as trophies, including skulls, hearts, and other organs, storing them in his freezer or displaying them in his apartment. The discovery of Dahmer's crimes in July 1991 horrified the nation. Police were alerted by Tracy Edwards, a man who escaped from Dahmer's apartment after being restrained and threatened. When officers searched Dahmer's home, they uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains in his refrigerator, and barrels containing acid used to dissolve his victims' flesh. The sheer scale of Dahmer's depravity was unprecedented. Dahmer confessed to all 17 murders in chilling detail, showing little remorse. During his trial in 1992, he pled guilty but insane. His defense argued that his actions were driven by a severe mental illness, but the jury rejected the insanity plea, and Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. On November 28, 1994, in prison, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, in a prison bathroom. His death marked the end of a life defined by unimaginable cruelty. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. His crimes shocked the nation, not only because of their brutality, but also because of how seamlessly he concealed his dark side behind a mask of normalcy. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His early life was marked by turmoil. He endured relentless verbal and physical abuse from his alcoholic father, who belittled him as weak and effeminate. Despite this difficult upbringing, Gacy managed to carve out a seemingly ordinary adult life. He worked as a contractor, owned his own business, and was a respected figure in his community. Gacy was active in local politics and even performed at children's parties and charity events dressed as Pogo the Clown. To those who knew him, he appeared to be the epitome of a friendly, successful, and generous man. Between 1972 and 1978, he murdered 33 young men and boys. Most of his victims were runaways, hitchhikers, or young men he lured to his home under the pretense of offering them work with his construction company. Once they were inside, Gacy would overpower them, often tricking them into putting on handcuffs by pretending to perform a magic trick. His victims were subjected to brutal sexual assaults, torture, and eventually strangulation. Gacy meticulously concealed his crimes by burying the bodies of his victims in the crawl space beneath his home. Over the years, the stench of decomposition became undeniable, but Gacy always explained it away, blaming plumbing issues. This allowed him to continue his killing spree undetected for years. One of the key moments in Gacy's capture was the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978. Piest had told his mother he was meeting Gacy about a potential job, but never returned. His family immediately raised the alarm, and the investigation quickly led to Gacy, who was already on law enforcement's radar for a history of sexual assault charges. Police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home, where they discovered suspicious items, including clothing that didn't belong to him. The breakthrough came when investigators detected the smell of decay emanating from the crawl space. A second search warrant revealed the horrifying extent of Gacy's crimes, the remains of 29 victims buried beneath his home. 4 additional bodies were later found in nearby rivers, bringing the total to 33 known victims. His trial began in February 1980 and drew national attention. Gacy's defense team attempted to plead insanity, claiming that he was not in control of his actions. However, the jury rejected this argument, finding him guilty of all 33 murders. He was sentenced to death. While on death row, Gacy continued to manipulate public perception. He became known for his paintings, many of which featured clowns, a grim reminder of his pogo persona. These artworks were sold, and the fascination with Gacy's crimes only grew. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words, "Kiss my ass," encapsulated his unapologetic demeanor until the very end. John Wayne Gacy's story remains one of the darkest in criminal history. Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His horrifying crimes spanned decades, claiming the lives of at least 49 women, though he confessed to murdering as many as 71. Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His childhood was far from stable. He grew up in a troubled home with a domineering and abusive mother who exerted an unsettling control over him. Ridgway later claimed that he harbored conflicted feelings of hatred and sexual attraction toward his mother, a psychological turmoil that may have contributed to his later crimes. After high school, he joined the Navy and served a brief stint in Vietnam before returning to civilian life. Ridgway's killing spree began in the early 1980s, targeting women in and around Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. Most of his victims were sex workers or runaways, women he believed would not be missed, and whose disappearances would draw less attention from law enforcement. Ridgway would lure his victims by offering them rides or soliciting their services, often using his job as a truck painter to provide plausible reasons for being in the area. Once isolated, he would strangle them, sometimes using his bare hands and other times with ligatures, and then dispose of their bodies near the Green River or in remote wooded areas. These dumping sites earned him the nickname the Green River Killer. He often returned to the locations where he had dumped his victims' bodies to engage in necrophilia, a macabre act of control and power over his victims, even in death. He later admitted that he deliberately left some bodies in clusters to confuse investigators and mislead them about the timeline and extent of his crimes. Ridgway eluded capture for nearly 2 decades, largely because of his unassuming demeanor. He was married, held a steady job, and seemed to live a normal suburban life, which allowed him to avoid suspicion. However, advances in DNA technology eventually led to his arrest. In 2001, DNA evidence linked Ridgway to several of the murders, finally ending his reign of terror. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ridgway confessed to killing 49 women and cooperated with investigators to avoid the death penalty. His confessions were cold and devoid of emotion, as he described his victims as objects. In 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, the families of his victims confronted him, expressing their grief, anger, and the lasting impact of his crimes. Ridgway sat emotionless as they spoke, only apologizing in a monotone statement that felt hollow to those who had suffered because of him. His ability to live a seemingly ordinary life while committing unspeakable crimes is a chilling reminder of how evil can hide in the mundane. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, terrorized California during the mid-1980s with a brutal spree of home invasions, sexual assaults, and murders. His reign of terror, marked by satanic symbols and unrelenting violence, left communities gripped with fear. Born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez grew up in a troubled household. His father was prone to violent outbursts, and Richard, the youngest of 5 children, often bore the brunt of the family's dysfunction. As a teenager, he was heavily influenced by his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who regaled him with graphic stories of violence and murder. Miguel even showed Ramirez photographs of the atrocities he had committed during the war, including images of women he had tortured and killed. This exposure to violence at a young age had a profound effect on Ramirez, shaping his fascination with death and cruelty. In 1984, Ramirez began his killing spree in Los Angeles. Unlike many serial killers who target specific demographics, Ramirez had no consistent victim profile. His victims ranged in age from 9 to 83 and included men, women, and children. Ramirez's modus operandi was as horrifying as it was chaotic. He would break into homes in the dead of night, often entering through unlocked windows or doors. Once inside, he subjected his victims to unimaginable terror. He raped, tortured, and murdered with no apparent pattern. Sometimes he used a gun, other times he bludgeoned or stabbed his victims. In several instances, he left satanic symbols, such as pentagrams, at the crime scenes. His actions were often accompanied by chilling declarations, such as shouting "Hail Satan," reinforcing his self-proclaimed devotion to evil. One of his youngest victims was 9-year-old Mei Lung, who was raped and murdered in a San Francisco basement in 1984. Her death was one of Ramirez's earliest known crimes and underscored the depth of his depravity. Another particularly infamous case involved the attack on Lillian Doi, an 83-year-old woman whom Ramirez brutally assaulted and murdered in her home. His ability to target such a wide range of victims added to the public's terror, as no one felt safe from his attacks. Ramirez's eventual capture in August 1985 was a dramatic conclusion to his reign of terror. After a fingerprint left in a stolen car linked him to the crimes, his photograph was released to the public. Recognized by residents in East Los Angeles, Ramirez was chased through the streets and subdued by an angry mob before being handed over to the police. His arrest brought an end to one of the most terrifying crime sprees in California history. At his trial, Ramirez's behavior was as chilling as his crimes. He showed no remorse and even reveled in the notoriety he had gained. Famously, he flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm and declared, "Hail Satan," during a court appearance. After a lengthy trial, he was convicted in 1989 of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death, but he spent the rest of his life on death row. Ramirez died in 2013 of complications related to cancer while awaiting execution. The random nature of his violence meant that no one felt truly safe, a legacy of fear that lingered long after his capture. What drives someone to become a serial killer? The stories of these horrific serial killers leave us with more questions than answers. Which of these serial killers do you find the most chilling? Do you believe justice was truly served in their cases, or do you think some of them received punishments that were too lenient? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe to Wandering and Wondering for more such content. And remember, stay aware, stay safe, and always trust your instincts.